Good day, Governance and Control to students. Welcome to Unit 6, General Controls. In this particular lecture, we will be looking at general controls and diving into the 7 categories of general controls. So let us begin. If you just look at the first slide where we look at the different industrial revolutions, we currently find ourselves in the 4th industrial revolution. And whilst the 4th industrial revolution brings about a number of new technologies, the basics of technology or IT remains the same. So, for example, IT risk is still there, whether it was within the 1st industrial revolution or even now in the 4th industrial revolution. So, controls that we see within general controls, which we'll be looking at in today's lecture, just is an indication that whichever system you used, and no matter how complicated that particular technology is, these controls will still be relevant. So the first thing when it comes to looking at general controls is that no matter what type of computer you use, it can be your general PC, it can be a mainframe, it can be even an end user environment. The level or the type of computer environment does not really matter. General controls is applicable to this particular environment. We will be making reference to the term application controls. However, on a second year level, we will not be going into any detail around application controls, as this will be covered in your 3rd year of studies. Now, if we have to just look at a computerized environment, it is made up of a number of risks, which we can see in this particular slide. And general controls is considered to be the most basic set of controls that are required for an IT environment. So it's basically looking at the starting point of implementing controls within an IT environment. And once we've implemented controls around our computer environment, that is general controls, it is only then where we will look at application controls. We will look at some examples, but as I've mentioned, application controls will be done in more detail in your 3rd year of studies. So there are 7 main general controls. And how you can actually look at it is that in the middle year, an example would be, let's say we have an accounting system. In order to protect this particular computer system, we have various computer general controls that need to protect this particular accounting system. So let's just say this year is our accounting system. So we've got purchases, we've got debtors, we've got inventory, payroll. And in order to protect that entire accounting system, we have what we call then the general controls. So again, as we said, there's a number of IT risks that come about, especially considering that most businesses make use of IT, and as a result of that, there's a number of risks. For example, the risk of there being inaccurate data being processed, unauthorized access to data, a lack of segregation of duties. These are just some of the IT risks that any computer environment will be faced with. And in order to mitigate these general IT risks, we need to then implement general controls. So there are 7 categories of general controls. Now, for purposes of second year studies, you will only be required to know what the certain general controls are all about and not all the details. So the slides will be sufficient in order to provide you with the required foundation that is required in terms of general controls. So, as I've mentioned, these are the 7 types of general controls, and we'll be looking at each one as we go through the slides over the next few slides. So the first one that we'll start with is what we call system development and implementation controls. This, you should look at it as almost an accounting system. For example, some businesses make use of SAP or QuickBooks or Pastel. These are considered to be accounting systems. There are some organizations that build their own in-house accounting system. And in order to, if you currently have SAP and now you wish to use another system like, let's say, QuickBooks, we would then need to have what they call system conversion and documentation in place to ensure that if we're moving from one system to another, that there are required controls and that the conversion is done appropriately. So let's just look at systems development controls first. So this here is basically making sure that any controls over a new accounting system and any risks that come about as a result of this is properly developed and implemented. Now let's just look at an example, right? As we mentioned, we could look at something as building or installing a new system and why we need to have systems development controls to ensure that it works properly and there are no errors. Because the moment there are errors or the system doesn't work, it doesn't then achieve the objective. And this is here another example, testing a new accounting app before using it in real life. Because if we do not test something to see if it's working appropriately, we are going to have certain issues. So these controls are there to make sure that everything is running smoothly around a new system. The second thing that we're going to look at is purchased software. So within systems development controls is we have purchased software, as we mentioned, where you could use things like SAP or QuickBooks. And it's really making sure that when we actually purchase software, that it actually does meet the objectives of our business. Because, for example, if you're making use of QuickBooks, but QuickBooks doesn't have functionalities that you may require in order to run that particular system, within your organization, then it defeats the purpose. So that is why we need to make sure that these controls are actually in place. Systems maintenance controls is the second level or the second type of general controls that you get. And this refers to any changes that are made within the accounting system. So in the first one, we used our accounting system as an example. Now, within our accounting system, if we want to make any changes, we need to make sure that there are controls in place to ensure that these changes are carried out effectively and meet the objectives of the organization. So if we have to look at an example, we say when we are updating or fixing a particular system, these are considered to be changes, but we want to make sure that we have controls in place so that things obviously do not break, there's no problems, and ultimately we're making sure that that system is being run properly. And the example here that we've got here is checking software updates on a test computer before updating everyone else's. So the checking is, for example, a control that we can implement to ensure that that change was carried out effectively. The third level of general controls is organizational and management controls. This here is almost looking at making sure within our IT environment that we have the correct level of people completing the tasks in the IT environment, taking into account that the IT environment is an integral part of the organization, and we need to make sure that the right people are doing their jobs and that for example, they have the right skills, the right knowledge. There's a strict division of duties, also ensuring that these objectives are met when it comes to a particular organization. So an example here would be is rules and responsibilities set by the company to manage the IT department. And this here again is really important because having the right people doing the right jobs within the IT environment ensures that our IT systems are run effectively and properly. And this here is just an example of how an organizational structure can look like when it comes to an IT system. Then the next level of controls that we will be looking at is access controls. So if we have to think about it, here's our accounting system, and we want to make sure that people with the correct level of access are the ones that only enter or access the system. And access controls are made up of two types of controls: programmed controls and physical controls. So physical controls would be things like access cards. So maybe only authorized personnel can enter a certain part of an organization. So let's say, for example, it's the IT building, and only authorized people that have access cards will then be able to enter that business, that organization. Programmed controls would be things like passwords, multi-factor authentication. So anything that's being done with the computer. So this here is physical, so things that you physically need to do in order to gain access. And this here is to do with any controls that have been programmed on a computer. And this here is ultimately, again, to ensure that only authorized personnel can enter a system. Because if we have to think of the risks, if someone's unauthorized and not allowed to enter a particular accounting system, it will lead to unauthorized access, unauthorized changes, and ultimately causing chaos within our systems. An example of this here is to make sure that our data is actually being protected. Because let's say, again, if the wrong person accesses our system, for example, hacking, it's that there is unauthorized access to the system, which can then result in things like, for example, your money getting stolen, confidential data being stolen. And the example here is also only HR can access staff files. Imagine if everybody had access to this information. Number one, it can cause a lot of problems within an organization. But the other thing is that it's also going to be gaining access to unauthorized information that not everyone should actually have access to. Then we have computer operating controls. This here is literally controls built around the computer system to ensure that let's think of it as a computer or the system, that the system is actually operating and working the way it's actually meant to be done. So an example would be is, let's say we have daily checks to make sure. So for example, maybe a backup, or we need to make sure that there's a system cleanup that's done at the end of the day so that all computers run well. And these are just controls built into the system to make sure that ultimately the computer is being run effectively. The next set of controls we have is system software controls. So system software controls would be things like applications that are being installed onto a system. And what's important here is to make sure that the applications that are installed or the software that's installed onto the computer is actually authorized software by a authorized dealer, by the IT department, whichever it may be. But the important thing really comes down to is that it's only authorized and valid software that actually is being installed onto a system. So an example of this here would be if we have to look at Windows, Microsoft, maybe the Word app, Excel app, we need to make sure that those are vetted by our IT department before it can actually be installed. So for example, at UJ, if we want anything installed on our computer, IT has to be the ones who actually authorize and install this here. Otherwise, we can actually have malicious software being installed. The last set of controls is business continuity controls. So this here is making sure that all organizations run their businesses off IT systems. And in the event of something happening to our accounting systems, we need to make sure, and that for that matter, it can be any system, but the example we're using is an accounting system. And we have to have certain controls in place to make sure that in the event of something happening, we need to say we have some sort of backups, we have, some sort of a plan of action to make sure that the organization can still run despite there being some sort of an issue. An example would be is, let's say there's a cyber attack on the business. We need to then make sure that there's enough and sufficient backups, as an example, in place to make sure that we do not lose that important information. So business continuity controls is making sure that the business will still continue in the event of there being some sort of a detrimental or a massive issue, or within an organization. And that then brings us to the end of general controls. I trust that you all enjoyed it, and if there's any questions or anything, you are most welcome to reach out to me. Hope you all have a wonderful day further. Thank you. Bye.